Okay, so we discuss the perceptual decisions of monkeys. Can we also explain perceptual decisions of humans? Imagine that you have to make a perceptual decision, whether you see a house or a face. We can also apply the same diffusion mechanism and diffusion model to explain the perceptual decision. So imagine that certain photographs are projected on your retina, this information goes to your visual cortex, and perhaps there are house detectors and face detectors in the brain. Imagine that there is a decision-making area that simply compares the activity of the house detectors and face detectors, and if activity A is larger than activity B, I see the house, and if activity B is larger than A, I see the face. So this is the same diffusion process that can perhaps explain also our perceptual decisions. So we can indeed create this task when we expose our subjects to faces and houses, and sometimes these are clear faces, clear houses, and sometimes they see very ambiguous information. So we can actually ask our subjects in the fMRI scanner to make perceptual decisions. In the real study, Hauke Häkkinen conducted a pioneering, very incisive study using quite noisy stimuli. So he presented quite noisy faces, quite noisy houses, and sometimes you actually can see quite clearly face or house, but sometimes it's really difficult to recognize face and house. So sometimes he creates a conflict. So sometimes you can be confused whether you see a face or house. It can be a quite difficult perceptual decision, or sometimes there is no conflict. There is a clear, simple perceptual decision task. So we indeed can find in the brain face and house detectors. So Hauke Häkkinen actually used the diffusion model to explain our perceptual decisions. So he actually suggested that there are house detectors and face detectors, and they are activated when we see the ambiguous pictures, and there is a decision-making area in the brain, and activity of this area is simply proportional to the difference in the activity of the house detectors and face detectors. So if the activity of the house detectors is larger than activity of face detectors, we decide that we see houses. If activity of the face detectors is larger than activity of the house detectors, we decide that we see faces. So let's take a look to the actual data. We indeed can find face and house detectors in the brain. So green color indicates the brain area that is sensitive for houses, and red color indicates the area that is sensitive for faces. So if you would make a look to the graph, you will see that activity in this region really is proportional, for example, to the amount of facial information, the stimuli. So face-responsive brain area shows a maximum response to the clear faces, and the smaller responses in other conditions when there is less facial information in the stimuli. And you also see here clearly that house-responsive area produces activity proportional to the amount of house information in the stimuli. So we do find in the brain the face and house detectors. Can we also find the decision-making neuron integrator that simply compares sensory evidences for houses and for faces? And indeed, we can find this area in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is proportional to the difference in the activities in faces and house detectors. So this is an integrator. This is a brain area that integrates information from face detectors and house detectors. Interestingly, the activity in this brain area correlated with the individual performance of the subjects. The more this area was activated, the better was the performance. So activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is proportional to the difference in the activity of the face and house detectors. And actually, activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex predicts behavioral responses. So it looks like this brain area simply compare outputs from the detectors, from the house detectors and face detectors. So we can also apply the same diffusion mechanism to our perceptual decisions. So once again, this relatively simple model also help us to understand different aspects of the decisions. So, for example, bias in this model would be the different starting point for the diffusion process. So we can also model the deepness of the processing of the information that will be indicated by the drift rate, by the speed of the accumulation of the information during the diffusion process. So the very interesting study was conducted in the research group of Hauki-Häkkinen. They presented dynamic, noisy pictures of faces in cars, and subjects performed the perceptual categorization task. So actually, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex in some subjects was inhibited by transcranial magnetic stimulation. So overall, this experiment showed that indeed it increased the reaction time for the decisions. On the other hand, the modeling of the results showed that transcranial magnetic stimulation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex affected the drift rate of the diffusion process. So with this model, we can actually link the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the accumulation of the evidences for certain decisions. So the diffusion model is the most powerful model in neuroeconomics. This model suggests that brain monitors the differences for evidences for alternatives. And whenever this difference reaches a threshold, when the activity of the decision-making neurons, firing rate, reaches a threshold, the decision is finalized. It looks like that neuronal system, our brain, actually makes these calculations similar to the diffusion process. So diffusion model is only one model from a cluster of models called sequential sampling models. Currently, I think this is the most popular model, and there are striking evidences that brain actually makes this diffusion kind of calculations during the decision-making process.